We now have a session on global perspective with two speakers. And the first speaker is Kevin Fitzgerald. He is John Creighton University professor, endowed chair and associate professor in the Creighton University School of Medicine in Omaha, Nebraska. And he previously has been professor of Catholic healthcare ethics in Georgetown University, and also associate professor in the Department of Oncology at Georgetown University. He is unique in being, as a Jesuit, of having received a PhD in molecular genetics, as well as a PhD in bioethics in Georgetown University. And his research efforts focus on the investigation of abnormal gene expression in cancer, and on the ethical issues in biomedical research and medical genomics. And he is widely published in peer-reviewed journals, books, and the popular press. So please, Dr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you all again for the invitation to be here with you and to join in this really wonderful discussion about how to go forward with these developments in biotechnology. So we've already had wonderful presentations raising all kinds of interesting and challenging ethical issues and social issues. And I would like to just kind of step back a little bit and ask ourselves, in the midst of all that diversity, in the midst of all that difference, where can we find some kind of unity so that we can move forward? So one of the questions I think that keeps coming up is, how do we, and of course who the we is, fulfill the promise and avoid the perils of this developing biotechnology? And we've heard a lot, again, as I said, about the technical and the clinical promise. We've heard much about the social, legal, and ethical perils. So the question now for me is, well, who decides? Who decides what's forward and how we go in that direction? Interestingly, from the very beginning of our conversation in this conference, we've been talking about who is involved. And Ralph, of course, got us started with Hermann Hesse's magic, and he was a little worried that the train had already left the station. And I would like to propose that there might be more than one train. So the science train, yes, that's probably left the station and that's out running. But I don't think the public engagement train has quite left the station yet. And one of the areas that continually comes up is who's on that train. So Ralph and Daniel both got us started with talking about everybody being involved. And that statement has been repeated all the way through the conference up to this point. Everybody should be involved. We should have equal participation. So that, of course, raises for me the question is, well, what do we mean by equal? Obviously, we're not all equal in what we bring to this discussion. So now, oftentimes, the response has been and continues to be, particularly from the scientific community, well, all we need to do is educate the public. And once the public all knows what I know as the expert, whatever expert I am, they'll all agree with me, which, of course, is fascinating to me because when you go to scientific meetings where all the experts come together, they never agree on anything. So I'm really interested to figure out what that education is supposed to do. So what we need to understand, I think, in part is what is the goal here in terms of equality. And in that sense, I would argue that what we want to do is we want to give people what they need, whatever that might be, in order to make very good decisions, which will, in our hope, benefit all, or at least benefit a large number. And so it's not so much the education as it is the empowerment of everyone. How do we empower everyone? Well, certainly if we have the patient perspective, one of the things may be patients need to learn what's available out there. What are the alternatives? What are the risks and what are the potential benefits? And who decides what a risk is and what's a benefit? So we need to hear those sorts of things for the patient empowerment. But what about expert empowerment? What do the experts need to hear? Well, I think, first of all, the experts need to hear that, yes, they may be experts, but it's in a very narrow area. And this is a very broad topic. And so one of the things the experts could hear is the need for humility. I might not know everything, in spite of the fact that, I know everything. So that's one of the things that we can bring to this discussion. The other is that the goal is not necessarily going to be determined by the experts. Otherwise, why would we be asking for this large global communication? So I think what we need to do is make sure we are framing our expectations and our anticipations in the right way. And again, from the very beginning, we had some really good questions that were asked. Laura got us started off with some excellent questions, which again, I would suggest lead us into some interesting areas where no one is really expert. So for instance, she brought up the question is, well, a lot of these genetic interventions are to correct or replace or substitute defective genes. Well, who decides what's defective? I mean, we just heard a wonderful presentation on the possibilities of addressing blindness. And yet we know, and it was mentioned before, that that same intervention in the deaf community led to huge social disruption in that community because of the people who said, well, wait a minute, deafness is not a disease, it's a difference. And if you think, well, that's kind of rare and that's a whole different sort of thing, I suggest again, and I've given this in many talks over the last decade or so, there's a group of people that have a disease. It's called Laron syndrome. And it's considered to be a very debilitating disease because they're very short. They don't grow. Tallest member of that community is probably about 4.5 feet tall. And yet, they also never die of cancer, and they don't get type 2 diabetes because of the same genetic difference that makes them short. Are they diseased, or are we diseased? How many of us here in the room can say, I don't have any risk of getting cancer or type 2 diabetes, but they can? So who's going to decide who's defective and who's not? And how are we going to make that decision? And then when we make that decision, who's going to decide what a risky intrusion is or modification and what isn't? And then who's going to determine who has access to that? And who's going to determine which alternatives we're going to use? Do we leave that completely up to the experts, or do we go with what we've learned in healthcare, in that often what the patient desires is what's going to lead to the best outcome? So when we have this discussion, when we embrace this global dialogue, the question that arises is, are we willing to hear from other people perspectives and positions that we ourselves do not embrace? In fact, some of perspectives and positions that may in fact undermine the very global dialogue itself. So for instance, and this is one I'm sure all of you are familiar with, here was a researcher who thought he was going to move the boundaries of healthcare way into the future, and he was going to be probably a Nobel laureate. And yet the response to his genetically modifying 3 infant girls was quite the opposite of what he expected. And again, interestingly, after what he did in his presentation, the scientists all got together, and this is from the organizing committee at that event, and if you'll notice, said that we need to have this broad, organized global dialogue so that we can look at these issues and determine, and I put in the emphasis here, meet the needs of the underserved population. Well, who determines who's underserved? And how should we serve the underserved? because I'm going to argue again that I don't think everybody agrees on even that issue. This was an amazing book. It was some research done by an American psychiatrist named Jonathan Metzl. He's at Vanderbilt University. And being a very concerned healthcare professional, he looked out. Vanderbilt is in Tennessee, and he looked around at the communities in Tennessee, a state in the United States, and he saw that there were a lot of people who were not getting the health care that they needed, particularly in rural communities. So he went out to some of those rural communities and interviewed the people. Now, many of the people he interviewed fell into a particular social category, right? These were poor, rural, white, Caucasian Christians. And when he interviewed these people, he came up with a recommendation. He said, what if, looking at you with your need for dental work, need for glasses, your hypertension, your type 2 diabetes, all of these healthcare issues that you have, which aren't being adequately addressed because of where you are, what if the state of Tennessee said, we will take care of you. All your health care will be free. The reason the state of Tennessee would do this, because in the end it would save them money, right? Back to your preventive medicine. And in the book, Jonathan Metzl records that 80 to 85% of the people in these communities said, no, I don't want that. Well, wait a minute. I thought we all said everybody wants to be healthy. So here was the opportunity for them to be much healthier. And they said no, they didn't want that. Why? Because if everybody gets it, that means those people get it. And those people in those communities didn't want those other people to get those benefits. So when we say everybody should be involved, what do we do when we involve the people who say everybody shouldn't be involved? How do we engage people who say, no, I would rather suffer just to make sure that those people suffer more than I do? Now, we may say, well, that's not a lot of people in the world. I would recommend to go back and look at elections recently, both in North America and in Europe. And let's see how many people really want everyone to benefit. So how are we going to go forward with a global dialogue about biotechnology when the people who are yelling at each other are actually using the same slogans to represent opposite ends of the political spectrum? I found this absolutely fascinating. On the one hand, you have the people who say, I should have every reproductive option I want because it's my body, my choice. And at the absolute other end of the political spectrum, you have everybody saying, I don't want a vaccine because it's my body, my choice. Well, wait a minute, last time I checked, that's the same principle, being applied in completely opposite ways for public policy. Oh, well, so much for translational ethics. Okay, so how do we go forward? How do we begin to do what we say we think is the right thing to do? Especially when even the experts don't agree. So this is something we discovered in the United States. I think it was also something that was found in Europe and around the world. And I dealt with some of these healthcare professionals who were just not going to get vaccinated. And it's not that they didn't have MDs or nursing degrees or even PhDs. It's just that they looked at the data and came up with very different interpretations than I did. So how do I engage with these people who actually made the decision to leave their careers over this issue? So if we think, that the technology itself and all the benefits that it's going to give us is going to be enough to persuade people, we're fooling ourselves. how do we begin to generate a kind of global dialogue that could actually move our world forward? Again, this has been mentioned several times, but this idea of trust. There has to be trust. Well, how do you engender trust, especially in our current day and age? Well, this is, again, not a new issue. This is a work that I did with a research assistant of mine, Samantha Wu, who was fantastic. But we just really dug into this idea of, well, wait a minute, if trust is necessary, how do we get there? And again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel to do this. There have been a lot of people who have done research in this regard. But what I think we have to do is be aware of that research and make sure that we apply it in the ways we move forward. Instead of saying, all we need to do is educate people and suddenly they're going to agree with us, which we know from our research is not going to happen, what can we do? Well, I think one of the things we have to recognize is it's not going to be a one solution fits all. If you're going to reach everyone, you're going to have to do it in different ways. And you're going to have different expectations from each interaction. Now, this is not going to make the scientific or the biotech community happy. Why? Because it's a very fragmented, very incremental, very slow, and very unsure process. And last time I checked, biotech and big pharma hate all of those things because they're not good for business. Well, but this is where we are. And what is good for business is if the world is on board with where the business is going. So how are we going to try and move some of these things forward? Well, as usual, Marie-Jo came up with an answer and she didn't even know it. So she said, well, you know, I go around the world and everywhere I look, there are cell phones. And that's true, right? You can go to the favelas in Brazil, you can go to the slums in Bangladesh, you can go everywhere and you will see cell phones. How is that possible? So it's got to be possible that there are some things that everybody wants, right? Why? Just empirical evidence. Everybody's got cell phones. So there's something that industry did right. It met a need, and that need is so extensive you can find it everywhere. How can we do something similar, say, in biotechnology? Well, again, what are the things that everybody has, needs, wants, desires? Should we extend our scope in our conversations with the global populations, not just to human engineering, because that might not get everyone's attention or interest, but to say we have a technology that changes life itself. That includes the food you eat from plants, that includes your pets, the animals you care about, which for some people mean more than other human beings. So can we frame a discussion in such a way to try and capture the interest of everyone we're going to be trying to engage? And can we find a way to do that in such a way that we use social institutions that do in some way, shape, or form engage just about everybody? Now, the normal one, of course, that everybody tries to look at are governments, national governments, and that is certainly a place to start. But of course, we've done that multiple times on multiple levels in multiple places, and again, it doesn't necessarily work. I'm not saying throw it out, but I'm saying recommend or recognize that one size doesn't fit all. There's another institution recently that has tried to do an outreach to all of its members. It's an interesting place. You might have heard of it. It's called the Catholic Church. They're in the process of a synodal outreach. And the idea is to reach out to all the people in the Catholic Church around the world, all 1.2 billion of them, and ask them, where do we need to go forward? Well, gee, if we can reach 1.2 billion in the world, that would be a pretty good sample in terms of reaching people around the world. I bet the statisticians would love to do a survey and get 1.2 billion responses. So can we look at what the church is doing in terms of saying, if they can do this outreach, and again, remember, even in the outreach, if you get a negative response, in other words, people say, we don't want to talk about that, that gives you data about what they're interested in. So can we come up with something similar to that? Again, emphasizing the things that people care about, their food, their pets, their loved ones, maybe even themselves. And ask, how would you think if this were impacted by bioengineering? As we do that, I think we're going to have certain ground rules. One, of course, is to say, we hope that you engage in this constructively, right? You can, of course, say, I hate biotechnology and I'm never going to use it. All right, that's fine, but why? So we have to get a little more depth in that. I think we also have to recognize the fact that there will be challenges in terms of how we, again, interpret, how we integrate the information that we get. This, too, is something that's been a project in the Catholic Church for some time, and that is that we need a framework that is inclusive, that is dynamic, because, as we heard, things are moving all the time with our AI twins, that's comprehensive, and that's integrative, that pulls all these different perspectives together. And as we do that, we may, in fact, learn some interesting things from groups that perhaps we didn't expect to learn from. So I will end with this saying that has been going around more and more in the last 10 years or so, which comes out of a South African tradition, but I think it really captures where we need to set ourselves in order to go forward properly, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you very much for your presentation. I now want to give the floor to the next speaker, Anna Borovetsky. She is a professor and chair of the Department of Social Medicine and Organization of Healthcare at Andrea Stampar School of Public Health and the University of Zagreb. She is a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and she is also president-elect of the European Society for Philosophy of Medicine and Healthcare. Born in Croatia, in Zagreb, she graduated at a medical faculty there in medicine and also in philosophy and comparative literature. She also holds degrees in the European Master in Bioethics from the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, Belgium, and a PhD degree from the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. She is a clinical pharmacologist and toxicologist and has a Master of Public Health degree. Her field of work covers areas of medical ethics, bioethics, and public health. So it's a pleasure to give her the floor.
Thank you for an introduction. Since this is a session about global bioethics, I will look from the perspective of global bioethics on what we have been saying so far. So, as Kevin pointed out, two of us, we are kind of going to summarize everything what has already been said here, okay? So, when we were talking here about engineering life, we were talking about engineering life prophecies, okay? And Henk ten Have wrote an interesting book that was already mentioned. It's called Bizarre Bioethics. And basically, this book is about issues that we have been facing in bioethics so far. And they are mainly done on individual level. One of the chapters deals with genetic issues, and these issues are described as prophecies, and basically this is what we have been doing. So we are going to prevent incurable diseases. We are going to have better drugs that can cure diseases, for instance, in the genetic specific way. They can go to genes and fix them. And somehow in all of these discussions, and also yesterday when we saw the video, we were talking about extending human life. We had a person who was 104 years old, and the person was running still. So we would like to better our lives, not only to live longer, but to have a better quality of lives. And this is all well, and this is all nice, but there is always a problem with prophecies, okay? Because they are based more on imagination than on facts. And they are based on the ideas of progress and perfectibility. And these ideas are part of reductionistic philosophy and materialistic views on life. And there are always some sort of value judgments, as Hank points very nicely in his book, where humans, behind these prophecies, where humans are seen as a part of nature that can be somehow fixed and improved. And also, there is the idea that we as human beings can be somehow detached, abstracted from the context, from not only from the context, but also that we can also break with the developments that have been going on so far in the human history. So this is very utopian idea, very prophetic idea. And also, basically, what is behind all this, and this has already been mentioned by Professor Jotil, that behind all these, we have very liberal approach, and therefore, this liberal approach that we have been applying sometimes creates inequalities, and if we are going to continue on in this way, we can maybe create more inequalities. So this is all present here. So I will try to do the analysis of what we have been doing so far. I am going to use the tools that Heng has presented in one of his papers. And this is the analysis from the point of global bioethics. Because Henk wrote, and I'm very glad that Henk is chair of this session, and this sums it up very nicely. And we have a working group in the Pontifical Academy of Life dedicated to global bioethics. So, so we need a more critical bioethical discourse. And this is not the discourse that is going to be based on these exceptional cases, but we should look at the things on the global scale and also look at the cultural context where these genetic developments are being unraveled. And also we should look at the social process, how this has all been disseminated and how does this all go on in our societies. So if we are going to use a global bioethics framework, then this is basically not the ethical analysis of individual cases. It's concerned with ethical issues related to health, disease, and medicine. The promotion of health and relief of suffering have more prominence than other values. And this is more about the social ethical aspects than on the individual ethical cases. So here, when we have a moral problem, it presents on the individual patient level, but it should be explained and understood through the society, on the societal level. So. And the global level. So it's not the analysis of a single case. It's more than that. It's maybe a starting point, but then we should really try to fit all this in a more global perspective. So this also kind of requires us to have cooperation and solidarity. And there is also talk about global governance when we are talking about certain issues and common perspectives. And also, it's about, there are certain ethical principles that are applied here, but they may differ from the principles that are going to be used when we talk about individual cases. Some of them may be the same, or maybe a bit refined, but then some of them may be a bit different. So we need a more, I would say, social ethical discourse when we talk about global problems. So this is a broader moral discourse. There are things that have been mentioned that are important for discourse. This is a human vulnerability, social responsibility, sharing benefits. So this is that type of discourse. And this is this does not only concern theoretical frameworks, but also there is a part of advocacy that can be included. Usually we talk about universal principles, and as I said, it's in a way dialogical in nature. It starts with the individual case, and then we have to see how this can be referred into the more global perspective. So it's a bit different. So when we talk about principles on that level of analysis, then we can go to documents like the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights of UNESCO, and then here are the principles: human dignity and human rights, benefit and harm, autonomy and individual responsibility, then respect for human vulnerability and personal integrity, privacy and confidentiality, equality, justice, and equity. Equity in the sense that we give to those that deserve or need most. Then we talk about non-discrimination and non-stigmatization, respect for individual diversity and pluralism. Then we talk about solidarity and cooperation, social responsibility and health, sharing of benefits. Then we also talk about protecting future generations, and this has been mentioned. We talk about protection of the environment and biosphere and biodiversity. So these are the more global issues that we discuss, and these are the principles that can work in this more global analysis. So when we look at the issues that we have been discussing here so far, then I would say 4 questions are important, okay? So how should men and women conduct their lives in the age of the new possibilities for engineering life? Then how should costs and benefits be distributed in the just society? Who should have access to the new possibilities of engineering life? And who should be protected from subjection to it? Because this was also mentioned by the previous speaker. So when we talk about how should men and women conduct their lives in the age of the new possibilities for engineering life, then we can analyze and try to answer the following questions. So, are the individuals really able to choose? Do they have the choice? And are they really free to choose? Because sometimes they might be a social pressure, economic pressure to do something, to prevent something, okay? It's also important how the society looks at certain things. And how far should these things be done, and how far should we go in perfecting ourselves? Also, sometimes in this talk, there is a certain amount of vulnerability and manipulation, especially with vulnerable populations who have certain diseases. And then there is a question, okay, we have these options, but do really all people have actually access to them? And also, what does this procedure mean for the personal identity of an individual? And also, which is also very important, somebody said we should listen. Exactly, we should listen to the experiences of the people with certain conditions and who are undergoing certain procedures that we offer to them. And this can be very insightful. How should costs and benefits be distributed in the just society? Who should pay? And we have now different healthcare systems, and we have, during the COVID pandemic, these systems have been strained, okay? And do we really have to pay for everything? And how to make decisions? What proof of evidence do we need? Because normally, when you do clinical guidelines, you look at the evidence-based medicine, and this should be real proven. There should be clinical tests, there should be clinical trials done in a proper way. And then there is a cost-benefit analysis. And then you also look at the technology assessment analysis, and all this is important. So this may all be very nice and beautiful, but when you look on the cost-benefit or technology assessment analysis, we may say, well, this is maybe not well proven, or maybe this is only for certain patients. So when do we start with the treatment? With those that we just found out, or those that have already had severe consequences, and whether these consequences can be improved, because sometimes they cannot be improved. And we are basically telling people that maybe it can be approved and improved in a way, and then we are basically instigating the false hope in the patients. And can we really make decisions about implementation of such technologies based on evidence based without the pressure? Because there are, for instance, patient associations which pressure, for instance, healthcare providers. You should introduce this. And then when you do technology assessment and say, listen, guys, we don't think this is going to work, they say, oh, you're being wrong, this is not so, we have other evidence. So this is a constant discussion within societies and the people who do healthcare provision. And do we make decisions in each society, or do we look on the more global level? We have been talking about rare diseases, okay? We should do something, and there are different associations that deal with rare diseases. We should do something maybe on the global level, so that all people who have treatable rare diseases can access these benefits. And they are extremely expensive therapies. So we should have a global discussion about it and see whether these drugs really work. And this is another discussion. So who should have access to the new possibilities of engineering life? Only people who can afford it. What about those individuals and societies who cannot afford it? And this, the COVID example is a clear case with the vaccines. And we have been shown the lecture yesterday where you can see that the majority of vaccines have been introduced in the well-developed societies. Underdeveloped, they didn't have any benefits from it. And then the question of patents. So if we have such cases where this is important for on the global level, we should remove the patents, and this has been a huge discussion about it. Then the question, who should be protected from subjection to it? So do I really have the right to say no? Sorry, I'm not going to do it. And can I say no without being pressured? So these are the questions that can be part of this analysis. And I have been involved in some thinking about the connection between bioethics and politics. I recently did some talk about it, and when I was looking at all our discussions, basically what we were talking about biopolitics here. In a way, because this area of genetics is connected also on a biopolitical level with a certain type of discourse. There is a type of discourse that one of professor at my school, Professor Vuletic, Emeritus, discourse analysis, did for different public health issues. And I think this has a connection with public health. And I'm going to do the analysis of what we have been saying so far, okay, and who is involved. And this can be very insightful. And maybe we can see whom are we missing in these discussions and who should be more included. So when we look at the actors and participants of what's going on in this area and who is talking about these issues, they're of course scientists. They say, oh, we have this new wonderful discoveries. We are going to save lives, improve lives. And then there are journalists. Oh, they like new things. They say, oh, we are going to save so many people. And there are, of course, patients. Oh, we need these things, okay? And then what we are talking here is some sort of, I would say, scientific utopia. Without really clear analysis, what are the repercussions of all of this? The attractors are people who are kind of guiding the whole discourse. And in our discourse, these are basically scientists, journalists, patients' organizations, and of course, pharmaceutical companies. There is a huge profit to be made. Even in the rare diseases, there is a huge profit to be made. And then when you look at the interpretive level, how do we do it? It's based on scientific concepts and then, of course, emotions. So somebody is against, somebody is for it, and then we talk about ethical issues, legal issues. And then we ask ourselves, what have we gained from this discourse as a community, okay? So we were able to find solutions, this is clear, and we have some sort of consensus about implementation, but it's more on the level of individual societies than on the global level. So some societies are already involved in this discourse, and how are we going to do it? And some societies are far away. So we have to see now from this analysis, whom are we missing? And maybe include them more in the discussions and see how this all can be improved. And this is where I stop. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have time for a few questions. Yes, please. Yeah.
No, only one reflection more than a question, and a question also for the two of you, is related. I think that one of the main problems that we have about science is quite similar, or even is the same that we have about constitutional democracy. I am talking in a very special day for Italy. I think that in science, and I had this experience in Spain during the procedure of prioritization of the vaccine against COVID. I was a member of the group of experts, and where we were following the message and the ideas from the people about this vaccine, the mixed formula and all these things. No, even the better we did, the worse was the situation considering the people, the position about the vaccines. And I think that perhaps the problem between science and constitutional democracy, and using this idea, is that we take everything for granted. It was very typical. We think science is good and this is the real, and we think constitutional democracy is good, one of the conquerors of the society. So I think this is a problem. We need to develop not an emotional narrative, because I don't like this idea of emotional democracy, because it's very close to populism, but to develop some different narratives, considering that we need to involve people in the real science, involve people in the real constitutional democracy, which is constitutional democracy. It's not direct democracy or different form popular democracy. So I think we need to change the narrative and develop more attractive narrative, because our narrative were very attractive for us, that we take things for granted, but they are not attractive for young people. I am not trying to say that we need to develop TikTok now and explain our democracy using TikTok, but perhaps to use different narrative, a little more emotional. So this is one, and I want to know about your opinion about this. Thank you and congratulations, because the roundtable was excellent.
Okay, I agree with you. In my opinion, when we look at the discourse or narratives, I think they are too emotional. I agree there should be some sort of emotion, but I think also that the problem is that we don't know. I think this is what I observed. We don't know how to communicate adequately the scientific facts to the general population, because we presume that in general this is self-evident, so people can understand it. Statistical, this is very simple, so they can understand it. I don't think that the majority of people really understands it, and they are sometimes confused. So we should try to see how to communicate these things better, so the general public can really understand it and make them applicable to their everyday lives. Because if it's a scientific thing somewhere in the air, it's there, so we have statistical, but what about me? How does this reflect on my situation, and what should I gain from it, or what am I going to lose from it? And sometimes this is lost, because normally we talk in more general terms, and we don't come to the specific person, and each person has different needs and perceptions, and we don't see it in this way. This is my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's right, and this is something that's growing in healthcare right now, narrative medicine, right? Why? Because understanding how the patient is experiencing their condition can only be found out by asking the patient and doing what Carlo mentioned yesterday, listening. So if we do have to come up with a new narrative, I think the way we start that is by listening, to see what narratives are out there that are different than the ones that we embrace. Yeah.
Okay, last question. The gentleman in the...
Thank you. One quick comment and then a question. I would take some disagreement with your position. Maybe I've been in the biotechnology industry for about 20 years. I recently left it. I would say I don't have as dark of a vision of it as maybe you do. The for-profit biotech model for we have 40 years of data of biotechnology companies working with orphan diseases and patient groups, and I would say the data suggests it's been a wildly successful experiment, and there are millions of patients that are alive today because it has worked. And Exhibit A, from my perspective, I also spent a little bit of time working in the antibiotic space. Exhibit A of failure is the superbugs crisis, because nobody can make any money in hospital-based antibiotics, and that's why for 30 years we've seen a decline of suppliers and an increase, one of the reasons, increase in superbugs that are uniquely lethal today. So a little different perspective. But my question to both of you is, you both essentially, I think, agree that there are these tricky, thorny global issues going forward, and that there needs to be more convening and more dialogue with all these diverse stakeholders. I don't have the answer to this one, which is why I'm asking the question. So who are the conveners, and when do they start? Because I know in the gene editing space, there's been a lot of talk of we need to get going on convening. Kevin, you showed some of that, but give your quick take on who are the conveners and when do we start, I think would be helpful. Thanks.
Okay. Well, yeah, so I tried to get at that a little bit, and I think, Tim, you're absolutely right. I mean, so this is something we've been talking about for quite some time. I think one of the assumptions, getting back to the narratives, in the scientific community was, well, we're going to be the convener, right? And by being the convener, we're going to educate everybody, and then they'll all agree with us. So, all right, that was a big, flawed assumption. So now, what do? I think, again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are groups out there that do this, right? Again, the Catholic Church is doing this right now. Governments do it all the time. So the question is, it's not necessarily who are the conveners, it's going to be who's the convener of the conveners. So who's going to be the one to make sure that this all is coordinated? That is a really interesting question. And I think it's going to require a group to come forward that is, to some extent, outside the current political fray. So groups that are often recommended for this. And again, it's not that I don't think they do wonderful things. I just think they're too politically fraught at the moment. WHO, UN, all that sort of thing. So, but we have models. WHO is a model. UN is a model. So what international global group could we pull together of trusted individuals that someone would say, okay, these people will coordinate what's already ongoing?
I think this is a good solution. I think as someone working in a public health school who was founded by the founder of WHO, I would say WHO would be the best place, and then see how this can be transferred to the national levels, because WHO already has a number of different policies regarding different issues, so I think this could be a good thing. And we should also work more on how to make WHO more important stakeholder, because I don't think that right now it's important. And I think because of the whole, how they handle the COVID situation, they're kind of on the sidelines. This is just how I see it, but this should be improved. And regarding to your comment, okay, I'm a clinical pharmacologist. I'm by the default skeptical, okay, about any drug development. This is my job. And then I really need a very high amount of proof that this is going to work. And then I also have to do the cost-benefit analysis and see whether for my healthcare system, and where, for instance, everybody is entitled to almost everything, this can really work. And about the antibiotic crisis, I think it's an unfortunate situation where physicians were not educated well enough to administer the antibiotics in a proper way. And then because of this, we have all these very resistant strains. And then I think we should put more effort in trying to solve this situation. But as you said, it's not going to be a very lucrative thing to do. But I think that we should try to solve even the non-lucrative things. I think for certain amounts of things, we shouldn't have a very high margin of financial gain. We can just do things pro bono for some reason and maybe lose some money. I know this is not very economically sound thing to say.
Scientists should be aware that there is an international organization for science, UNESCO. And you have all kinds of scientific organizations that have an international organization of scientific organizations, which is also based in Paris. So I would say some governments are not interested in UNESCO. The US is an example. They have withdrawn from UNESCO 2 times, and they're not a member at the moment. Because, and you can ask why, because governments don't like this kind of international cooperation, because they are interested in their own national interest. So, but there is a platform, and there are many scientists working together in this area of UNESCO. In the environment, there is international cooperation in regard to water, and there's international platforms for bioethical discussion. So I think there is an infrastructure already that maybe should not only be used by governments, but also by scientists and scientific communities. It is there. So I think before we enter into new questions, let's have a change, because now we have another session with young researchers. So thank you all for your contribution.